great pleasures for me of the new academic year at Pitzer has been the arrival of my new colleague, Geoffrey Herrera. Geoffrey Herrera is the Fletcher Jones Associate Professor of Political Studies at Pitzer, and his work on international relations, on the various impacts of various important technologies, from the railroad to the atom bomb to the internet. His numerous publications include his 2006 book, Technology and International Transformation, the Railroad, the Atom Bomb, and the Politics of Technological Change. And let me also welcome a second valued Claremont colleague, just personal connection here too. In 1998, I was on leave at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and while I was there, James Scott told me that one of his all-time best students had just taken a position at Pomona College, and that I should be sure to get to know her when I returned, and he was certainly right. Since then, I've come to know Heather Williams as one of the people in town, one of the faculty members in town, who teaches courses that I think every student should take. Her courses on the politics of food and the politics of water are courses that are really crucial for world citizenship in our time. She's the author of numerous influential publications, including her 2001 book, Social Movements and Economic Transition, Markets and Distributed Protest in Mexico. And it's a pleasure to welcome both Geoffrey Herrera and Heather Williams to join our two speakers after two really terrific talks. I want to thank them both for those talks. And we're going to start with comments from Geoffrey, then take some comments from Heather, and then we're going to open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Dan, for asking the panel. It's a great pleasure. As Dan mentioned, I study international politics and have a long-standing but extremely diligent interest in political theory. So what I want to try and do in my remarks is bring the two talks together in what I think is a useful shared framework. And I want to do that by touching on three different literatures from three subfields of political science. I know this is going to sound very much like a classroom exercise, but I think there's some payoff in it, so bear with me. In order, from political theory, from comparative politics, and then from my hometown, international relations. So here's the very dilettantish part. Those of you who have me in class know that I'm extremely fond of definitions, so here's my definition of democracy. In two parts, democracy is made up of what we'll call the institutions of democracy. Here I have in mind the substance, the institutions, the rules, the procedures of democratic forms of government. So it's a bundle of rights, assembly, speech, liberty, property, there are others, representation, elections, so forth. So the first part of the definition of democracy, the institutional aspect. The second, we'll call democratic values. These are attitudes, dispositions, values held by democratic publics that make a polity democratic. The obvious underlying argument here is that a polity with democratic institutions but lacking democratic values cannot be truly called democratic. What are democratic values? Well, an interest in and respect for human rights, liberty, and so forth, but I want to place special emphasis on a bundle of values that are maybe not always considered to be part of democratic values, at least maybe not in wide primes. Respect for difference. Now, in the debates about the language of multiculturalism, you would presume I mean respect for those of different ethnicities, different races, different cultures, and I mean that sort of. But what I really mean is respect for difference, respect for different views. One of the obvious potential outcomes of democratic representation in democratic elections is that sometimes one group wins, sometimes another group wins. And it's inherent for a democratic form of governance, for the values held by a democratic polity to include respect for difference, respect for others' points of views, that the possibility of those points of views and therefore the policy preferences that they might have some merit and deserve respect. Not necessarily deserve agreement, obviously, but deserve respect. And the reason why that's important is the second element that I want to talk about, and that is skepticism. Skepticism, not that things aren't to be believed, but skepticism that we can know for sure how things will turn out. Skepticism that we know for sure what the good life is. So you combine these two values together, and they suggest that a polity holding democratic values is going to be respectful of the different views of others in that polity, because they aren't supremely 100% confident that their policy preferences will result in good outcomes. So they might be wrong. So the political theory section of my comments is sort of over here, just to reiterate two aspects of democracy: a bundle of institutions, rights, and so forth, procedures, and democratic values. In what follows, I just want to talk mostly about democratic values, and in so doing, not saying that democratic institutions, as Lisa's talk suggests, are irrelevant, but just the synthesis, I think, focuses more on these democratic values. The argument from, or the contribution of comparative politics. Lewis Hartz was evoked. American exceptionalism is now being talked about a lot in the public discourse, especially surrounding the recent elections. But the advantage of a comparative perspective is that it allows us to situate the United States as one of a number of polities around the world. Believe it or not, the United States is not the only polity. The literature in comparative politics that looks at polities that have democratic institutions without democratic values is, I think, pretty unanimous on the view that those polities are unstable, prone to high levels of political conflict and even political violence. And to combine the theory and the comparative politics approaches suggest that these polities, they struggle to be truly democratic. So, in as much as the United States finds itself divided in ways that are incompatible with democratic values, then the United States may fall into this category. Lastly, the contribution from international relations. Now, this may seem like it's not going anywhere, but bear with me. So, about a decade or so ago, a bunch of insurgents in the international security field attempted to redefine the concept of international security, that is. They were deeply critical of the traditional concept of security as being obsessively focused on the state in national security. So national security policy was military policy, was war policy. Lisa's colleague famously called this system, the state system, several decades ago, a war system. So national security, in the views of these critics, is about and supports militarism and war. So they argued what we need instead is a different way of thinking about security. And what they suggested as a replacement is instead of national security, think in terms of human security. Because in the end, aren't both the actors but also the subject of politics people, individuals. And so the purpose of security policy should be the protection of people. Logic seems irrefutable. So this was spun out in a variety of ways. People who took this view said that when you use the human security framework, you can think in terms of environmental threats as being threats to security, or economic threats, such as, financial collapse, as being threats to security. So you start expanding the definition of what counts as security. A third thing they added to this list, which is what I want to place the great emphasis on, was, well, what's to be protected? They said, well, yes, individuals, but also communities. And what's a community? Well, the community is how the community thinks of itself. The communities are essentially self-defined, so the concept they developed was in addition to environmental security and economic security, identity security, identity or community security. So this was thought to be a great advance, and I was sitting listening to the two talks, and I think this is the key concept that links these two together: identity security. And the ironic thing is that those who deployed this concept and this expansion of the notion of security thought they were doing good. But I think this really just struck me, listening to two talks, is I don't think they quite reckon for what's a clear and obvious dark side, which is that identity security is really, really important. I think, as I say, what links the two talks together is the sense of a self-defined community protecting itself from perceived threats. The threats can be traditional international security threats, like international terrorism, or the threats can be black people who want to move into our neighborhood. But the concept, I think, is the same. So, tying these three literatures together, my summary, which might lead us to despair, is that this concept of identity security is very, very powerful. And also, I think, except under very narrow conditions about which I'm not entirely sure myself, but I don't want to say 100% because I'm skeptical, that identity security as a concept and its sort of actual lived examples is profoundly undemocratic.
Thank you, Geoffrey. And thank you, Dan and Lisa, for wonderful talks. Absolutely enlightening and difficult to grapple with. And so thank you for your work. It's so important. And thank you, Geoffrey, for your comments that were really interesting. What I want to do is just ask a difficult question and maybe step out of the material for a second and just look at the room and ask the meta. You know, what in fact are we doing here? I see 24 good people in a room, two sound people. Thank you for doing this in a time of great crisis. And I think, are people here because they're supposed to be here, or any of you here because it's a class and you have to be? Is this church for us some kind of penance to deal with the overwhelming guilt that one grapples with every single day, seeing what's going on and seeing how terrifying it is? Or is it some kind of therapy where we are constantly bombarded by the silence about these issues, the inability, the unwillingness of people to talk calmly about what's going on and what measures need to be taken to stop the most outrageous abrogations of democracy? Some assurance that the paper that we're getting on our doorstep in the morning is the same one that's actually being distributed to hundreds of thousands of other people, and that they're seeing the same information and yet somehow able to put it in a very different place. So I think what's interesting is that we have 24 people here, many of whom are, we learned a lot in these talks, but I mean the general message of what you're saying is probably not at odds with what many of us think. No one here didn't believe that Guantanamo Bay was an outrage, right? An illegal set of detentions of individuals. It was flouting Geneva Conventions and half a dozen treaties to which we are signatories. People are guilty there of committing crimes for which they have been tried in U.S., for which others from other countries have been tried in U.S. courts, right? There's no one here who doesn't acknowledge that California's economy was built on a kind of ground rent fascism, right? Where the deliberate capture of labor was necessary in order to develop first precious metals and water economy, and then later a commodity and agricultural economy. It was necessary to have streams of non-citizen labor that were brought here, kept non-citizens, kept from having property, and kept from assuming any ownership over the means of production, right? This is ground rent fascism. It became this kind of the normal way that sunny California is. So there are a number of conclusions. The first would be the simple one that the U.S. and California constitute very low-quality democracies. The second is, why is that? Maybe there's a socialization process in the United States that teaches citizens to deal with incommensurate truths and beliefs every single day. That's part of being an American, right? There's a belief that the Constitution is sacred and it's a living document and it has guarantees. At the same time that there's an affirmation every single day that those guarantees are routinely violated and that some people are more equal than others. There's a belief that the electorate should and does determine the character and direction of the state and that this bends toward justice. At the same time, that there's a belief that the national security state is and should be beyond the purview of the electorate because there are certain kinds of secrets that are being kept for our own good, right? So, and there's also a belief that that democracy bends toward justice at the same time that it's okay to engage in a certain kind of bullying, infringement of people's freedoms for the good of capitalism. Right? So, I mean, how do we account for the complicity of people in the abrogation of human rights or the participation of people in bullying or just outright evil? And it makes me think of that it's almost a party trick in an introductory philosophy class where we try to account for the existence of evil if in fact God exists. Right, and so there's this idea that God, if evil exists, God can be only two of three of the following things. God can only be omniscient. God can be omniscient. He can be omnipotent, or he can be compassionate, but not all three. Right. So if the God of democracy is the people, we can imagine that evil happens because people care and they could do something, but they don't know. So the sin is ignorance. Right? And Lisa, you talked about people as being ignorant rather than evil, I noted. The second is that, of course, people don't know what's going on for the most part. People care and they do know what's going on, but they can't do anything. Right? There's this idea that people actually are trying to do things. Social movements are out there trying to turn the levers of the system, but that in fact there's a shadow state in play, right? So there the problem is impotence of the people. And then finally, right, there's this idea that people could do something, they do know what's going on for the most part, but they don't care, right? And they're unapologetic about a majoritarian tyranny, and they're unapologetic about imperialism, they're unapologetic, quite frankly, about torture, right? Which introduces a very uncomfortable conclusion, right? That the American people are malicious. Right? And what do we want to do with that, right? Is this the cost of Arcadia, right? The found paradise, right? That in which the private is real and the public has to become a myth simply because there's not enough for everybody, right? So you just have to come get yours, hunker down, barbecue in the backyard, and not think about it, right? But I'm not sure I'm willing to believe that the American people are a malicious people, right? And so I'm wondering whether there is some kind of slippage, right? That's in these incommensurable beliefs and truths, and I'm wondering whether in our race in political science, right, to have lots of debates, not you, but a lot of people about rational choice, right, and to become economists, that we actually threw out an important set of hypotheses that emerged in the 1950s from social psychology, right? Leon Festinger wrote a really wonderful book. Do people still know this old book called When Prophecy Fails? It's the sociology of a doomsday cult, right? And he tries to figure out why, in this doomsday cult that he starts to study, why it is that you have a doomsday prediction, all right, and somebody says, you know what, the world is going to end a week from next Thursday, right, and everybody prepares for the end, a week from next Thursday comes, and the world doesn't end. Now, if everybody were a rational actor, when presented with empirical disconfirmation of what they believe, whether it's the
world is going to end a week from next Thursday, or the United States is a democracy in which the rights of minorities are protected and human rights are sacred, right, that people would suddenly get very mad at the cult leader, perhaps sue, and obviously leave the cult. But instead, Leon Festinger found that the cult didn't disband. In fact, the beliefs of the cult members became stronger than ever in this, right? And that the cult leader then conveniently explained that the world didn't end a week from next Thursday because people hadn't adhered enough to the beliefs of the cult, and that they had to be even more cult-like in order to precipitate the end as he had predicted. So here the idea is that the empirical disconfirmation of prophecy wasn't possible for those people because of something called cognitive dissonance, right? This idea that, right, I'm confronted with evidence that what I want to believe isn't true, but the emotional discomfort that's involved in actually admitting that what the evidence you've been presented with, in fact, disconfirms what you thought was going on, is too much, and people actually choose the comfort over this normal rationality that we assume is a part of the human fabric. So I'm just wondering whether there's something about the social psychology of cognitive dissonance that could help us explain people's choice to embrace comfort over empirical disconfirmation of prophecy here. And what we do with that is, I think it's really important. Here we have, Lisa, you kept saying, like, we have the empirical disconfirmation of the idea that torture works, and yet people are continuing to believe that because they are more emotionally comfortable with the fact that then past crimes aren't really crimes, they were protection. Right? And so I think, I guess I'm just pressing for us to think about this psychology, of mass psychology. Hannah Arendt introduced this idea the state could be murderous, and then also, can a state go mad, right? Or can a population collectively choose a madness? So I've gone way too long, but those were my feelings when I listened to this, and thank you again for your presentations.
Thank you. I'll just make an initial comment, and then maybe other people on the panel or questions. But it seems to me, if I'm listening to Heather and Geoffrey correctly, that in Geoffrey's comments is produced by identity, and explains people's willingness to participate and be complicit in certain evil. In Heather's comments, she's giving us a different social psychological mechanism that is, in some sense, taking that place. So we've been given in the two comments these alternative accounts of how there can be this information about this evil and people are living with it. And one account is that it doesn't so much matter because it's being done to other people, and that's where identity is explaining it. And in Heather's comment, there's this kind of social psychological mechanism of it's too uncomfortable to accept the conclusion of that. Now, those may not be incompatible, but they seem to me to be what our two commentators have offered us, that they're functioning in similar ways in their observations.
I was thinking about connections as well between the two thoughts, and I was wondering if either of you or any of you could see how political whiteness, as it applies in your talk, could be used as also an explanation of why we so aggressively went after a racially categorized Arab enemy after 9/11, because the same concept of whiteness was being attacked by these terrorists as non-white. They're very, very, very brown, as they were given on the media, and as we saw in airport screenings and these things. So I was wondering if you guys could comment on the connection
okay, Nigel?
I'm sure that we can tell a story that supports that in the case of the United States and Arabs around the world. But with the British, it developed an ideology of torture to explain why they were torturing very, very Caucasian Irish people in the 40s, 50s, before that, 60s, 70s, 80s. So it's not, from a comparative perspective, you don't need racial difference.
I actually disagree. I mean, I think that the racial difference is quite significant, but not like sort of statically predictable. I mean, what I think we saw, and one of the ways in which race played out in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was that we are all Americans. I mean, to some extent, and particularly if you're looking at the kind of look at the African American community, like there was a sort of a shared way of like we Americans can really hate and tolerate all kinds of things that are done to defend us. And so, I had previously taught at Morehouse College, and I had gone back in the aftermath of after 9/11, after the Abu Ghraib, when the public ostensibly knew about what was going on, and there was, identical forms of apologetics among African Americans on that score. But the issue of race and resistance and repression, I think, plays out, and it comes out a lot in prisons, for example. Islam has become, I mean, first of all, the fact that the United States is indiscriminately targeted, and, both Muslims in the United States, I mean, the rounding up and disappearing of thousands, at least several thousand people immediately after 9/11, the war policies, that a kind of Islam, particularly in prisons, has become, a real, sort of a politics of resistance now. Jose Padilla is one little example of how many Latinos are actually converting to Islam in prisons, including in California prisons, because Islam is seen as actually a militant fight back, organizing kind of principle, but actually people, because of their racial minority / disadvantaged status, can then sort of latch on to that. So I think that there's something that we have to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, so I would agree. I don't see what the relevance, because there's been cases in other places where race is arguably not read the same way, I don't see how that bears on the role of racial identity in the U.S. I mean, I'm making the argument actually not that there's static identities that exist prior to these conflicts, and then the conflicts then unfold. So you have whiteness, and then you have the ballot, and then you have a community saying, let's use this to consolidate power. I'm arguing that it's the conflict itself that is productive of the identity, that it's through the conflict that people come to see themselves as something called white, which has nothing to do with their biological, cultural, or politics. It's an imagined identity. And so, and I think something similar is happening in a kind of state of constant war making. It's like, what kinds of identities does war making produce? Such that, the facts absolutely don't matter, because it's an investment in that identity. And it's an investment not in the identity's kind of ugly undermath. It's an investment in the kind of identity as emancipatory. Such that, I mean, I think that's the part I got about kind of liberal ideology, that doesn't matter, because it's an identity that's constituted there. So I just want to say that not as kind of identity as a dependent variable, as something that's produced, not as something that exists kind of prior to politics. And I would think that, Lisa's talk for me made me think about how political whiteness is shaped obviously through Americanism, through something about the current crisis of the moment, and the way it allows us to say, we are not complicit in anything. We can indeed find something external that helps us explain why we found ourselves in this.
Actually, I know you want to say that, but could I just make one more point? So I'm on a dissertation committee, one of my graduate students, Eric Love, tomorrow. Brilliant dissertation on he looks at actually Islamophobia. That's the problematic term he refers to, but the kind of pan-ethnic mobilizations, particularly the pickup really after 9/11. In other words, not so much just by Arabs or Muslims, but people who Americans think are Arabs or Muslims, including Latinos or Sikhs and et cetera, and the kind of responsive reactions to that. And then I don't know if one would say it's really an investment in whiteness, but it's the assertion of like it's un-American to discriminate, so sort of invoking that civil rights sort of agenda, not completely successfully, because I mean, if you look at the Park 51 scandal in New York, it's everybody, you know, the public discourse is overwhelmingly like they Muslims, somehow as if they're not actually Americans too. So it is this really responsive and dialectical.
And my second point, just much shorter, which is a connection between your point's conclusion, is that this, there's a fourth alternative to the problem of evil as it exists, taking your definition that we need this identity as Americans, that we accept that evil exists, but because we have the identity, we want to beat them, so we will let evil exist for a short period of time. And we think that this is going to go away after the conflict is elected. So we know it exists, and we let it exist, and we keep it going with a false belief that the government will somehow cease to exist and want to keep one.
Yeah, I think this cognitism is more powerful than temporary unleashing of evil. I don't, maybe you can think of some evidence, but I can't think of evidence in current discourse around we know this is wrong, but it's being maybe, well, not even can.
No, I think that raises a great point. I mean, the scenario that arises for me is, well, if we are freedom-loving Americans, is it possible to be a freedom-loving American if there's not evil somewhere in the world? Because otherwise, what meaning would being a freedom-loving American have? So it is the way that the identity itself is dependent on an exterior that must constantly then be tortured.
I'm also wondering that if Guantanamo also is really key to this question of identity, right? Because Guantanamo is this deliberate space that's created not just, of course, with the prisoners who were taken from Afghanistan, but of course it's used to house Haitian refugees in the 1990s, right, with AIDS, and who are HIV positive, right? So we have during the military campaign, which is mowing down the pro-democracy movement after the coup in 1991. Right, you have thousands of Haitians who are trying to escape tyranny, and they're being either thrown into the sea or taken to Guantanamo Bay, into the interception at sea. Right, so it becomes this place where we acknowledge that things that we could not possibly rationalize in our wildest fantasies with being consistent with the rules we believe in, white country or not, right? Because we also don't, we won't say we are a white country. Right? At the same time, it's very, very important to our identity to say that we are a country of immigrants. We do love Martin Luther King Jr. We do embrace the civil rights movement. We have made progress. We have perfected democracy, and yet Guantanamo Bay is this place it's almost a Shangri-La. Right? It's a place where we say time doesn't exist, the Constitution doesn't exist. It's this quicksand place where it's somewhere near the Bermuda Triangle where things can go to disappear. And I think that there's this question about, so Guantanamo Bay was this deliberate place of the invisible, this liminal space where it was neither ours nor not ours, right? And I think that as it's become visible, right, has it really kind of crept toward becoming ours? And so I'm wondering whether Guantanamo Bay is going to be necessary in the future because we have seen what's there and then we have somehow accepted that and said we can actually start to internalize that into our own system of interrogation and laws. And I'm wondering whether, this whole question of whether there's a Guantanamization of the system. Like, are we starting to create netherworlds literally on physical U.S. space where we can be a democracy and do absolutely terrible things to people, even just to extract information or simply because they're not citizens or simply because?
A lot of people who worked on prisoners' rights issues in the United States. I mean, many of the things that happened in Guantanamo, perhaps with the exception of waterboarding didn't really happen in Guantanamo, but sort of two people who end up in Guantanamo. Other things, protracted isolation, stress positions and so on. Those are actually practiced in the United States prisons, and I mean, at least in the kind of dehumanizing ability dread system. And so U.S.-focused prison activists were very frustrated. Like, why are we all of a sudden caring about, you know, terrorists in Iraq when nobody cares about the guys who are locked up in Pelican Bay? I mean, it's an interesting and weird. I mean, it's a weird and there's a reason, and the reason is that, you know, and it's a democratic issue, that Americans are responsible democratically for the laws that govern our domestic imprisonment, whereas wartime things are international. But I would just say, I mean, I don't have the answers to some of these questions, but when you're talking about Guantanamo, the only way, if we think about Guantanamo as a boil on our ass, we have to, you know, and Cheney is, you know, exemplifies the pus. We have to cauterize it like prison sentence. We have to actually criminally prosecute people to take a lesson. I mean, that's something I think that you can't just hope the boil will sort of go away. The pus will still be there. You know, we'll come back again.
That is the best description. I don't know how we're going to top that. It's also, and we have a couple questions, John, and then we'll go around in this direction.
I'm trying to make sense of my notes here, but I found it interesting what you were saying about getting back to this larger topic of, you know, how our democracy is so undemocratic. And something I've always noticed that plays into it, at least in America, and this kind of started with me in the 2000 election, kind of aftermath, is this sense of national identity, you know, what it means to be an American or American values. And a lot of that comes out of this idea that we affirm to believe in human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And when something bad happens that our leaders do, there's this belief, I'd like to go against that if the American public is ignorant and change that to the American public simply has this idea that this can't happen here because we're America. And it turns into kind of a Nixon-like quote of the quote of, you know, if the president does it, it's not illegal. You have the same problem. So I'm really interested in how people may fundamentally not believe something's happening simply because that's not an American value. It turns into this sense of disbelief. And then a little just related to that, I recently finished Dr. Philip Zimbardo's book from Stanford University. He wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect, How Good People Turn Evil. A lot of it was an autograph, but I was very interested in how that plays as well as this social psychology idea of how that it kind of connects to an idea of how we're supposed to act as an American, even if other people, the higher ups are saying, torture these people because you're doing it in this name, this value, is it okay? It's a little bit of a hodgepodge, but I'm really curious on your comments on this idea of national identity relating to disbelief, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting, very powerful observation, and I think brings to mind all of the people who come armed with the facts that attempt to break through our cognitive dissonance, and the response of the polity is to throw them out of the national community. I'm sure you've probably been called anti-American by
I always like sort of front end that say, I'm the true conservative, conserving the rule of law against the private radicals. I believe in taking the offense.
If you insist on bringing uncomfortable facts to light, you get a sort of identity security impulse kicks in, and you kick critics out of the community. Well, obviously, they aren't part of us because they're not going along with the collective delusion.
I just think back to, you know, when the kind of observations of racial justice activists in the 1940s on the revelation of the Holocaust, and, you know, there was this shock, how could this happen in, you know, the cradle of European democracy, who said, have you looked at the last 400 years? This is the culmination of it. There's absolutely nothing shocking new. And in part, and in no way to kind of dismiss, you know, the shock of what happens at Guantanamo. I mean, I think it is indeed absolutely connected. I mean, the number of, California's prison building now is absolutely unprecedented. Absolutely unprecedented in human history. There's more, Michelle Alexander's book tells us there's more black men now disenfranchised because of felony convictions than there were at the end of the Civil War. So if we pose that question, then how do we feel about freedom, we might ask who's the we to which we're referring. You can go to Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles and see an absolute, you know, kind of negation of what we might think of as lived embedded democracy, and still call Los Angeles this great, free, and wonderful city. So
and a city defined by diversity.
By diversity, freedom, opportunity, all of these things. So, how those disavowals take place, I don't think just exist in this kind of pushing it to this exterior, but I actually think we manage them much more in our kind of everyday life.
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, it's something that sort of, was being sort of snide, but I will try to elaborate that in a democracy you get the government you deserve. So we have the liberal processes and institutions, generally speaking, and the problem is us. I mean, we are the illiberal problem of our country. And to some extent, I mean, if you think about liberal democracies, of which the United States is sort of a historic model, the Constitution and certain kinds of notions about those are like the prior agreements upon which the country will govern the state and its relationships. When you let the people, have what they often want is racist, reactionary, illiberal outcomes. And to the extent that the law constitutes a certain level of the only times you ever get these illiberal democratic outcomes pushed back is when courts will then rule and say, I'm sorry, but you're not actually allowed to discriminate. And the courts are not perfect enforcers of liberal principles. And so I think ultimately it's not, we're not doomed forever, but this is really about the issues of educating, education I think becomes extremely important, and it becomes important for people, I think that Daniel's book is awesome. I want to teach it so people can see, as much as possible that what they think about themselves is, only partially true. I mean, why do they hate us? Well, we mentioned Guatemala and Lebanon. I mean, so people who don't know about Guatemala or Lebanon or whatever and don't understand why there are sort of critiques of Americans from abroad, it's like that's not the problem is why don't Americans know American history? Why don't Americans understand the principles of the rule of law or non-discrimination? So the principles, I think, are there. The problem is the people, and the solution is education. But it's an education that actually needs to name what is false. I mean, it's about being somewhat polite yet vicious in attacking people who are peddling lies, propagating untruths, global climate deniers. I mean, those are people who are worthy of being attacked on a daily basis. I mean, I believe in an aggressive, our brains are weapons, mine is a predator drone, I'm going to catch it. That's what I think we should do. So.
I want to comment here. Well, I actually heartily agree with that, and I want to add a component. I do think that schooling, right, and the lack of certain honesty in K-12 education is incredibly important and contributes to the kind of structured ignorance, I would call it, socialized ignorance. But I also think we have to then be aware of just how differential schooling is and how differential the political economy is in giving people an opportunity. So schooling, as I said in my opening comments, right, it gives differentially some people in society a capacity, a relationship to literacy where they can use literacy to express themselves. A much larger group of people have a different relationship to literacy in which, yes, they can read well enough to function in certain jobs that expect literacy, but they're not socialized to use it to express themselves and to represent themselves. And as long as that's true, those people will count less in this democracy. And so, we have to get the schooling not only to be better, but it has to be better symmetrically and evenly, not just for the people who do best in it, not just for the people who are allowed to do best in it. And then, similarly, after schooling, when you talk about people's entry into the political economy, if you have a system in which working people, they spend so much time getting into a job at a hotel in Los Angeles where they're paid, a very low wage on a bus because there's no adequate public transportation and there's no affordable housing. And then after doing that job, they spend more time on the bus coming home. When is the time in their lives that they're going to be able to be participants in the democracy? And again, until you structure the political economy and in some sense a geography of housing and transportation that affords working people opportunities to be more participants in the economy, you're going to get a skewed democracy. And I think you have to keep looking at the skewing of participation through differential relationships to literacy and knowledge in the school system, and the skewing of opportunities in terms of relationship to time in the political economy. And when those things have to change to get more participation from more people, so that the democracy isn't skewed and screwed from the beginning by so overrepresenting some people and leaving so many other people out.
I mean, maybe just in response to the question about the character of democracy, it seems to me actually existing democracy is a play on actually existing socialism,
right,
which offered the question that to study socialism in the abstract, that doesn't make sense in many ways. You have to start with how people are leading it. I think the same thing is true here. So, I mean, consider San Francisco, which has among the most well-educated and indeed liberal and active electorates in the country by county. San Francisco County has the highest of any county in the country drug sentencing disparities by race. There's no discrepancies in white-black drug use. In fact, studies consistently show that there's higher drug use, median drug use among self-identified whites. And yet, to be black in San Francisco and to use drugs or to be caught is to almost guarantee that you'll be caught up by the criminal justice system. So I want to then ask that question of how's it come to be that in a liberal, forward-thinking, enlightened electorate, we can wake up and say, well, 140,000 of our fellow Californians are waking up this morning in industrial cages. And I'm so happy that we are not in a closed-minded place. And if there is some remnants of fascism, it's Dick Cheney's fault. So, and that part of it, I can't say that I know, but that's the contradiction I'm interested in, bring a little bit less than kind of projecting that it's all the unsavory among us.
I think, if it's possible, I actually don't use the word democracy very often in my classes. I usually prefer the term electoral regime. And I find it more helpful, right? So we can, and if we do talk about democracy and talk about the sine qua nons of democracy, then usually, it comes down to this issue of, well, after elections, what else is necessary to constitute something that approaches a democracy? Actually, it was Bob Dahl decades ago who issued the use of the word democracy and opted instead for polyarchy. I think it's also possible to talk about an electoral regime with authoritarian enclaves in which there are portions of it that are simply not open to the purview of the public, or in which majoritarian rule can engage in bullying and in the extension of an incarceration system that does effectively discriminate on the basis of income and race. So I think that's really important for people to make that distinction, and because the idea too of democracy is this empty. Well, I mean, I think democracy has been pretty well defined, at least in different bits of the literature. But if you were to ask people in the United States what they believe is best about their country, they would say freedom, not democracy. And freedom is this wonderful empty signifier that becomes whatever it is that you believe it is. Is it the freedom to go to TJ Maxx? Is it the freedom to, I mean, really seriously. And so then if it's freedom, then, whatever the U.S. does must be also democratic. That's my sense, is that it's this empty signifier of freedom that's even more dangerous. Democracy, maybe it's more of an asymptotic relationship of countries toward it, that, in the best of circumstances, the most careful electoral regimes do approach something that we could call democratic, and that, the others are in a scatter plot out there somewhere. That's how I think of it.
I have Stu and then Alan. What did you?
Follow up on this real briefly. Okay, so I fully agree that we ought to kind of step away from a minimalist definition of democracy, like Schumpeter who thinks of democracy as elections, right? But the challenge really for us to think about this like America is that you have a constitution that has these values enshrined. So I mean that's why it's more
Meadow performed that last year a couple of times on her show.
The National Lampoon, back when it used to be funny in the 1970s, did a version of how a bill becomes law, in which, step one, the bill is suggested to a congressman, and you see a bill, a cartoon of a bill lying in a bathtub full of money, and the congressman says, oh. And the bill is sent to committee, and you see and the bill has written on it, kill the Negroes, right? The bill is amended by the committee, and you see the committee putting things on like homos too, right? And by the time it comes out the end of the other process, there's a lynch mob with the bill, standing behind them. So, there's a discrepancy between what we say the process works like and what it actually works like, as the title of this panel implied. But, the people who passed things like the California Initiative laws back in 1911 really believed that they were cleaning politics up, that by turning decision-making back to the populace as a whole, rather than one house of the legislature, all the rest of that corrupt procedure that Lampoon was making fun of, that they were improving it. And if the analyses here are right, that the public is ignorant, or it's subconsciously white, or all of the rest of it, right? Does this suggest that what is needed is less popular democracy rather than more, or is there a different prescription that's being offered here?
I think I'm going to ask Alistair's comment and then ask the panelists to finish, because and we will continue for a half hour with reception outside. I hope people will interact and continue talking, but then it's going to get very loud and we won't be able to talk. So I'm going to.
So people make decisions that are not in their interests all the time. We buy Big Macs, we buy Cokes, and part of the reason we do that crap is because it's sold to us in very effective ways, and it's never sold to us in terms of the Big Mac's relationship to health. It's sold to us in terms
question, the populace, the people that the populists imagined were not, in fact, all people still. I mean, populism is deeply ingrained with eugenics, with very, very class and hierarchical notions of who possessed the wisdom to make decisions on behalf of the people. And I think that's still true when we talk about some people of California. The move is we're talking about universal people, but I think we're actually talking about a very specific cultural worldview that announces itself as the people. So that's what I want to say, that there's a contradiction in populism as well, that it renounces its particularity, but it's often complicit in a very singular way of looking at things. And I think it's exactly right that interests are always constructed, but then it raises the question, is there a kind of transparent, natural, fair way to construct interests and then a corrupted way? I think that it's all, interests are never preordained. They're always, come through. And I think there's a professionalization of that process, but I think people have always had some investments in the messages in the ways that it allows to see them. So I don't, again, I want to get away from, we would just get the Hoover institution to stop being so, I'm not saying you're saying that, but I'm saying there's the externality that's corrupted the process. But then how do we account for its, 400-year history?
In regard to your point, I think that the ideals of democracy, like the ideals of communism, like democracy and communism, are too good for real people. Right? People never live up to the ideals, and so we sort of make do with that. And I think that's actually a critical. That's why I'm a Foucauldian. Sort of like you wake up every day, and every day it's today. So I find that to be very liberating. I would suggest on the point about the funding of right-wing thought, just for any students who haven't seen it, about 2 or 3 months ago, Jane Mayer came out with a really excellent expose in the New Yorker called Covert Operations about the Koch brothers who were funding the Tea Party. And to some extent, I think that while across time one can look at this right-wing stuff, a lot of what the current undemocratic, illiberal, or even anti-democratic funding of certain kinds of arguments, denying climate change, etc., what they're looking to, what the real, if we're just thinking ideologically, what the real sort of danger / menaces, and Glenn Beck articulates this commonly as, everything since the New Deal, right? Except for the period of Reagan. So in some ways they want to sort of roll back to a pre-New Deal kind of phenomenon, and that's something that one can give students and other people a stake in understanding why that's problematic. And so I always will start my overcrowded first day of the quarter class saying, look around, because like some of you are sitting on the floor, it's because of Ronald Reagan, go talk to your parents who voted for Prop 13, that kind of thing. And so just to get people to realize, like, Prop 13, you weren't even born when it was elected, go yell at your grandma, because that's the reason why you're not going to get into my class. And just, make it real.
You want to reject the first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
On the populism question, sort of Machiavelli, drawing on Aristotle, famously wrote that in polities where the mass population is involved in politics, there is a healthy form of republic, and there is a degenerate form.
That's actually what I was thinking of for a question.
Democracy.
Right.
The reason I can't believe I'm saying this is because, of course, John Birchers are famous for saying, thank goodness we don't live in a democracy, but in a republic. Never mind that. On the think tanks, what I read, sense between the lines was a notion that at some point in the past there was a form of democracy where there was reasonably fair-minded but fact-filled deliberation about issues of policy. I'm just not sure that that's the case. I think the tools are more sophisticated now than they were in the past, and it's always fun to sort of try to endlessly talk about Eisenhower and his really weird, deeply uncomfortable television ads, and clearly people didn't get it, and now of course it's brilliant. But as James Janiger's The Control Revolution tells us, the tools of consumer manipulation and public relations and advertising are more than a century old. And as for the think tanks themselves, I guess the implication is either that they are themselves racist or torturers, or that these bad policies, bad outcomes, collateral damage, which is actually a really fun joke. That's awesome. Anyway, maybe, but my guess would be that I got my impulse as a citizen scholar is always to unless there's evidence to the contrary, that people actually mean what they say, they mean what they say. So that the right-wing think tanks believe this.
I guess I would quote up from Sinclair and say that it's hard to get a man to change his mind from hate to have the view that he has.
But, you know, I have something to say about the right-wing think tanks. If you look at their agenda now, I mean, it's tremendously cynical, and it's really shrewd. And what is the message now? I mean, they could give a fuck about who's getting tortured, and they never have given a fuck about who's getting tortured. The war was a convenient source of profit for a tremendous number of contractors. A lot of the war and the security apparatus is, in fact, really good business. There's a tremendous market in selling arms, especially small arms, and this is about deregulation. I think there's a number of people who are standing above it all. They're it's very, very clear that the United States is facing a balance of payments crisis from hell. Right? The debts are going to get called in, and the U.S. is basically useful as an extractive economy with a really large military, right, and a lot of bases around the world, right? And there is this sense there's extraction to be done and taxes to be avoided, and that's what that is about. And as far as the national security policy, I think there was some kind of pie-in-the-sky idea about the enforced Pax Americana, this enthusiasm for that at the beginning of the 2000s. That's totally eroded. Like, even stupid people aren't buying that. They've seen where these wars are going. And so it's just about, just don't tax me. Just don't tax me and leave me alone. I'm just going to hide under a table, and that's it. So it's a great point. And but wow.
I'm going to end with a quick comment about the think tanks, and then sort of two suggestions. About the think tank, it locates it outside of us. It's those think tanks, the externality. I would point in parallel in that same period to the fantastic homogenization of the economics departments that are in here, in colleges and universities. The expunging, the exercising of economics departments from the 1970s on of people who did left political economy, the making of economics departments, monologics, presentations of free market ideology. And I think that has had an enormously corrupting influence in terms of socializing the professional managerial class to believe in unregulated markets. And I think if you want to some great information about that, one of the really sort of obligatory texts for citizenship right now is the movie Inside Job, which points out that not only did university and college economics departments become such a monologic source of efficient market theory, but they were on the take. And the movie names the tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars that prominent economists were getting paid to put their name on articles that said that deregulation will create more economic stability and more economic growth and better welfare. And I think that the homogenization of university and college economics departments inside here, not just think tanks out there, is crucial. So, my suggestion is people should see Inside Job, and the other text that hasn't been mentioned today that I will recommend, which I think is brilliant on our topic today, is Arundhati Roy's new book, Listening to Grasshoppers, Field Notes on Democracy. It is one of those few books that in details asks us to look at actually existing democracy in mind. So, please continue the conversations outside with refreshments. Thank you.